Go.
So, good evening, friends. Tonight, we're going to continue the reading from The Taste of the Earth by Thich and Hanh. And the story we'll be reading tonight would be The Spiral Palace. So King Thich was unable to sleep. Impatiently, he waited for daybreak, which could bring the promised river messenger, the one who could help him complete his spiral-shaped palace fortress. Construction on the palace had come to a halt after 6 months of catastrophe. Walls had collapsed time and again, despite the best efforts of the kingdom's finest architects and builders. The idea and design for the unusual palace were the king's own, and he was determined to see it to completion. His architects shook their heads and said they could not go on. Such a palace can only be built by the gods. It was impossible to build walls as high as the king wanted. How would they hold the heavy stones? The king's plans were too ambitious. He envisaged fortress walls twisting like dragons up the steep hill, encircling a fine palace at the top, which would command a sweeping view in all directions. He wanted the palace roof to spread out like the wings of a giant Garuda bird. The king's dream was bringing nothing but misery to his people. Hundreds of workers had been injured or killed while working on the project. The king turned a deaf ear to the people's cry. Many whispered that the angry spirits of those lay in the king's fight to usurp the throne from King Hùng were responsible for the accidents. That to seek vengeance for their deaths, they would not allow the king to complete his palace. Sometimes, late at night, spine tingling wails and moans would be heard at the foot of the hill. Some people claimed they heard the mournful plucking of a ghostly sitar by the river at night. Still others talked about the innkeeper's daughter, who was possessed by a spirit. Day and night, she shrieked and cursed the king. The innkeeper, terrified that her blasphemy would be reported to the king, kept her locked in a room by herself. King Thich had heard all these rumors, but chose to ignore them. He had heard no wails or departed souls. One night, however, he was awakened by strains of mournful sitar music. The anguished tune made him uneasy, but he still did not believe in ghosts seeking vengeance. Nonetheless, he heeded the advice of his ministers and had a great altar built to evoke Dragon's Emperor's aid. The altars were soon finished, and the king began to pray. Suddenly, an old man with a long white beard appeared. He took a look at the half-completed fortress and shook his head. He said, "If you continue to build on this way, you are doomed for failure." The king asked, "Venerable sir, can you explain why we are unable to complete the spiral palace?" "This design is too intricate and ambitious for you to complete on your own. Tomorrow at daybreak, I will send river messenger to help you." The old man departed despite the king's pleas for him to stay longer. Now the king could not sleep. Was that distant sound the sitar again? He rose to his bed and lit a lamp. He paused aside his curtain and looked up at the stars shining in the cloudless sky. Strains of music, now louder, drifted towards the window from the river. The sad sounds conjured up an image in the king's mind of hundreds of hands of desperately trying to clutch at something. Then the music faded, but it was not more than a whisper mingling with the night breeze and crickets chant. Suddenly, he heard a clang of swords and a noise like crushing bricks and stones. He held his head in his hands and shook it as if to rid his ears of the disturbing sounds. Weary, he leaned against the screen and found his thoughts drifting back to simpler times. He remembered his youth when his father had been an acquaintance of King Hùng VIII. A closer friendship did not develop between the king and his father due to the great difference between their personalities. King Hùng VIII had been a jovial, friendly man. His father, it must be admitted, was vain and longed for power. Thuc's father wished to ask for the king's beautiful daughter in marriage to Thuc and sent a servant to convey his wishes. The king responded by laughing and saying, "You'll tell your master that if he wishes to ask for my daughter's hand in marriage to his son, he must come and speak to me directly. I cannot decide such an important matter through an intermediary." Thuc's father considered the king's response an affront to his pride. He felt deeply insulted and allowed his anger to poison his heart. He plotted to overthrow King Hùng and began to build a secret army. When he learned that King Hùng VIII had given his daughter in marriage to the mountain god Sơn Vương, he decided it was time to strike the capital. Before he could summon his army, however, he fell deadly ill. He called his son to his deathbed and made his last request. "Son, I depend on you to lead our troops to victory against the king. Avenge your father's honor." Thuc obeyed his father's last wish and mounted an attack. King Hùng had placed too much faith in Sơn Vương and Dragon Emperor to defend the throne for him. His own defensive preparations were too weak to withstand attack. Because the rebellion took place in July, the people's strength was already wasted by the floods that resulted from the battle between Sơn Vương and his brother Thủy Vương. Sơn Vương, trapped in the mountains, was unable to bring relief soon enough to King Hùng. Faced with certain defeat and overcome with grief, King Hùng drowned himself by jumping into a well. Thuc declared himself king and replaced the formal court with members of his own clan. It took 8 more months of fighting, however, to wipe out the many pockets of resistance. The new king had to dispel rumors that he was a foreign invader. He had to convince the people that he, too, was a descendant of Old Gold and Dragon Emperor and could continue to observe the traditions long cherished by the people of Vang Lan. Because every blade of grass and every leaf in Phong Châu held memories of the long reign of the Hùng clan, King Thuc selected a new site for his capital in the district of Phong Khê. He envisaged a mighty spiral palace fortress on a great hill to herald a new era. A cock's crow called King Thuc back to the moment. It was dawn. He washed his face and changed clothes and waited in his reception quarters. Before long, an attendant entered to announce the arrival of River Messenger. "Your Majesty, when mists still clung to the water, we saw a golden turtle swim toward the shore. He spoke the language of humans and introduced himself as River Messenger. He turned himself into an old man with a long white beard." The king asked that River Messenger be escorted to his chambers at once. He invited the old man to be seated in the royal couch. King Messenger spoke. "I am Kim Hui, chief assistant to Dragon Emperor. He asked me to come assist you. Put all your worries aside. Your spiral fortress shall be completed. Now, show me your efforts thus far. The king led Kim Hui to the hill. Although rubble from the collapsed walls was piled everywhere, there were enough portions of the walls remaining to give Kim Hui a sense of King's design. He examined it most carefully, now and again shaking his head, and mumbled something to himself. At last, he looked at the king and said, "You have undertaken an enormous project. Your design is an inspired one, but you have caused the people too much suffering. You must not force such great burden on the people." The king said, "I am afraid that if I do not complete the palace after all this work, the new dynasty's reputation would be at stake." "I have been thinking the same thing. Therefore, I intend to help you, but in a way that will conserve the energies of the people while completing the fortress just as you have envisaged it. Please arrange a meeting for me with your master builders." The meeting was arranged without delay right at the foot of the hill. Kim Hui used chopstick to draw diagrams on the dirt and met at length with the master builders. They walked up the hill, looking at every interval where walls had collapsed. Kim Hui walked back and forth, taking measurements and pointing out details with a stick. Among other things, he showed them how to design a more effective shoulder yoke for carrying supplies. It was dark before they were finished. The king had dinner waiting when Kim Hui returned to his quarters. Kim Hui said, "Your Majesty, send half the workers home to their farms and villages where they are needed by their families. Provide them with ample supplies of food, clothing, and medicine in exchange for their hard work. The remaining workers will be enough to complete the fortress." In addition to paying the workers, the king followed Kim Hui's counsel and organized a special offering to the spirits of all those who had died in the rebellion. And while working in the palace, monks and village elders from throughout the kingdom were invited to attend. A great altar was heaped with platters of rice, sweet potatoes, and other dishes. During the 14 days of offerings, the food was distributed to the poor along with clothing and medicine. On the 7th day, Kim Hui asked the king to go with him to visit an area called Thich. When night fell, they wanted to stay in a local inn. The innkeeper was afraid to let them in. "Your Majesty," he said, "ghosts haunt this humble tavern. It is not possible to have a quiet night's rest here. I would be honored to offer you a meal, but please find another place to sleep." The king replied, "We are not afraid of ghosts," and insisted on staying the night. The king and Kim Hui were shown to the room next to that of the innkeeper's daughter. At midnight, a violent banging began at their door, accompanied by blood-hurling shouts and screams. The king was sure that no young girl would make such a horrible disturbance on her own. Kim Hui poked his head out the window and shouted, "Disturb this place no more!" But the racket did not cease. The window shutters rattled and shook. Kim Hui enlisted his magical powers, tossed sparks of fire at the window, creating a barrier of light through which no phantom could pass. Still, the banging, the screaming lasted all night. Only at the first cock's crow did it cease. Kim Hui and the king ran outside to see if they could catch a glimpse of the intruders. but all they saw was a streak of blue light disappearing behind a nearby mountain. That day, the king ordered an exploration to the mountain. A mass grave was discovered, heaped of human bones and broken cedar. It was obvious that a mass execution has taken place during the war. The bones and the cedar were placed in the coffins and brought back to the foot of the great altar. For 7 days, people came to weep and pay their respects to all those who had perished during the rebellion. The innkeeper came as well, reporting how his daughter had suddenly fallen unconscious after the bones were placed in coffins. When he ran to lift her up, she acted like one who had just woken from a long nightmare. Though a little weak, she was her normal self again, no longer possessed by tormented spirits. The bones were cremated in a solemn ceremony. Incense and sandalwood were thrown into the fire as people prayed. As the flames flicked the air, a white bird flew forth from the fire and disappeared into the white clouds. King Hui consulted the king on how best to run a kingdom. Remember, he said, that a country belongs to all its people. Unless hatred is the people cannot prosper. Always be an example to your people. Respect and protect their lives. Let no one die unjustly. Do not oppress the people. Only thus bloodshed be prevented. Be an example of peace and harmony to the people. If you live in peace and harmony, so will they. The king took Hui's counsel to heart. He even took a new name, An Yung, which meant radiant sample of peace. In order to be constantly reminded of his role and responsibilities, he renamed the kingdom Olak to show his reverence to his goddess ancestor. This king spent several months traveling throughout the kingdom. He distributed goods to the poor and ordered the release of all prisoners of war. The people's feelings toward him softened, especially when they learned he had received support from Dragon Emperor. The king saw that the poor received land, the hungry were fed, and that the people had the tools they needed to carry on their trades. He provided fishermen with nets and weavers with yarn. He listened to the grievances of the people wherever he went and did all within his power to bring about justice. When he returned to Phuong in late summer, he was astonished to find his spiral palace fortress completed. He gazed at it, speechless. There before him rose the palace of his dreams. At the hill's pinnacle, the palace roof spread out like the wings of the mighty Garuda. Designs of Garuda birds and dancing goddesses embellished the palace walls. Diamond-shaped windows were cut into the walls, affording the views of the surrounding countryside. King An Yung found King Hui waiting at the entrance gate. King Hui said, "Your Majesty, the palace fortress is now completed. It is time for me to bid you farewell." The king begged King Hui to stay longer, but he declined. "There is too much work awaiting me beneath the sea." The king, unable to conceal his disappointment in his voice, he said, "I have not had a chance to repay even a small part of your kindness. You have shown me that the people and I must be as one. So many tasks await our kingdom. The palace is completed, but now I must turn my attention to more pressing matters. There is talk of an invasion from the north. Can you offer me any guidance? Kim Hui answered, peace or danger depends on the merit of the country's king. If you set an example of virtue, you need never fear insurrection. As for foreign invasion, all rulers must be prepared for such attacks. I will leave you something to help you defend your kingdom. Kim Hui bent down and cut a slither of one of his toenails. It grew into the size of a bow. He showed it to the king and said, this is a magic crossbow. Watch. Kim Hui pointed the bow at a tall tree. There was a sign like a deep bell vibrating. Within seconds, all the leaves fell off the tree. In the event foreign troops invade Olaf, you need only point this bow at them and they will be dispersed immediately. The king accompanied Kim Hui to the river, where Kim Hui turned back into the golden turtle and nodding farewell, disappeared into the water. King O An Yun returned to his new palace with magic crossbow, pleased that he now possessed the means to protect his kingdom. And that, friends, is the end of the story. Thank you for listening.